For 14 days after my wedding, I was in pain. Not discomfort. Pain I did not tell anyone. I did not know I was allowed to. I made breakfast every morning. I hung the laundry. I sat through church on the second Sunday with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged into something that looked like a settled young wife. On day 14, I sat on the edge of the bathtub and looked at what I was seeing and I thought, this cannot be normal. And then I thought, but who would I ask? My mother had given me 7 words before my wedding. My mother-in-law had given me a jar of salve and said nothing. The women at church spoke around bodies the way you speak around a sleeping child, carefully, in lowered voices about anything else. I had no doctor. I had no phone. I had no language for what was happening to me, and my husband, a man who was not cruel, a man who worked hard and provided and believed he was doing right. My husband thought it was normal, because no one had told him either. My name is Hannah. I was raised Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I married at 19, I left at 28. I have been speaking publicly about what I lived through for 2 years now, and this video is one of the hardest I have made. I'm telling this story because I have received hundreds of messages from women, Amish, former Amish, and women from other closed communities, who described versions of the same 14 days, who bled and said nothing, who hurt and kept making breakfast, who did not know that what was happening to their body was something they were permitted to name. I want to be careful. I want to be precise. And I want to be honest in a way no one was honest with me. If you are new here, subscribe now. What I share on this channel is what I needed someone to say when I was 19 years old and sitting on the edge of a bathtub with no one to call. To understand what I am describing, you need to understand how the body was treated in the community I came from. Medical care in Old Order Amish communities is complicated. It is not uniformly refused. That is a misconception. Amish people go to doctors for broken bones, for serious illness, for childbirth when necessary. But the threshold for what counts as serious enough to seek outside care is very different from what most English people would recognize. And for women, for anything related to the reproductive body, to marital intimacy, to what happens between a husband and wife, the threshold was nearly unreachable. Because to name the problem you first had to name the cause, and naming the cause meant speaking about what happened in the marriage bed. And that was not spoken of. Pain that came from intimacy was not understood as medical. It was understood as adjustment, as the body learning its new role, as something a good wife moved through quietly and without complaint. I did not know the word vaginismus. I did not know the word trauma response. I did not know that what I was experiencing had a name, a cause, a treatment, and a community of medical professionals who could have helped me. I knew the word endure. I had been given that word in abundance. My wedding was in October. It was a full Amish wedding, long, communal, beautiful in the way those days are beautiful. There were 300 people. There was food and singing and the particular gravity that settles over a community when a covenant is made. I was happy that day. I want to say that plainly. I was 19 and I believed in what I was doing, and I loved Elam in the way a girl loves a man when she has been raised to understand love as faithfulness and provision and shared work. What I did not know, what I had no framework to anticipate, was what the night would ask of my body. I had been given no preparation. Not physiological, not emotional, not practical. I had been given submission language and silence and a jar of salve from my mother-in-law that she handed to me without explanation or eye contact, and I did not know what it was for until it was too late to ask. The first night was painful in a way I had not been told to expect. I told myself this was normal. I told myself my body was adjusting. I told myself by morning it would have settled. By morning it had not settled. I will tell you what those 14 days look like from the outside, and then I will tell you what they look like from the inside. From the outside, a functioning young wife. House clean, meals made. Face composed. Attending church. Greeting neighbors. Answering questions about the wedding with the correct expressions of gratitude and joy. From the inside, pain that did not stop. Bleeding that continued beyond what I had been told to expect from the fragments of knowledge I had gathered. A body that had become a place I did not recognize. A private terror I had no words to speak and no person to speak them to. Each night I made the same calculation. That refusing was not an option I had been given. That a good wife did not refuse. That whatever my body was experiencing was secondary to what my role required. I did not know I was making a choice. I thought I was simply being a wife. That is the thing about a system that removes your language. You do not experience yourself as someone who has been silenced. You experience yourself as someone who simply has nothing to say. I need to speak about Elam here, because this story is not complete without his side of it. Elam was not a violent man. He was not a man who took pleasure in causing harm. He was a 22-year-old who had been raised in the same silence I had been raised in, with the addition of headship. With the addition of entitlement dressed as covenant. He had been taught that a husband's marital rights were God-ordained. He had been taught that a wife's duty was to receive. He had not been taught to ask. He had not been taught that pain was information he was responsible for seeking out. He had not been taught that his wife's body had an interior experience that was relevant to his actions. When I finally said quietly, on the 4th day, that I was hurting, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "It will pass." My father said the same thing happened with my mother. He believed he was reassuring me. He had been handed his father's silence the same way I had been handed my mother's. And in that silence passed from father to son like an inheritance, was the assumption that a wife's pain during the adjustment period was ordinary, expected. Not a medical concern, not a reason to stop. I'm not telling you this to excuse him. I am telling you this because the harm was produced by two people who had both been given nothing, and one of them had been given authority over the other. Here's what I believe now, after speaking to many women from my community and communities like it. The older women knew, not all of them, not every detail of my particular situation, but they knew that young brides hurt. They knew that the first weeks of marriage were physically difficult for women who had arrived completely unprepared. They knew because they had been those women. They knew because their daughters had been those women. They knew because it had been happening, unremarked and unaddressed, for generations. And the knowledge was held in silence because speaking it would have required acknowledging it. And acknowledging it would have required asking why. And asking why would have led eventually to the question that the system could not survive. Whether a wife's pain was acceptable collateral in the service of a husband's covenant rights. That question was never asked. So the knowledge stayed where knowledge stays when it is too dangerous to speak, in the sideways warnings. In the salve handed without explanation. In the brief touch on a young bride's arm that communicated something that could not be said aloud. On the 12th day, a woman I will call Miriam came to help me with washing. Miriam was 60-something. She had been married 40 years. She had buried 2 children and raised 6. She was a woman who moved through difficulty the way water moves, finding the path without announcing it. We worked at the wash line for an hour without speaking. And then she said, while unpinning a sheet and not looking at me, "There is something called witch hazel. It helps the body heal. You can get it at the drugstore in town. You could ask your husband to fetch it and say it is for your hands." She moved to the next sheet. She did not say why I might need it. She did not ask if I was hurting. She did not name what she had noticed in the way I was moving or the color of my face or the particular careful way I had been sitting at church. She handed me a practical solution wrapped in plausible cover, passed without eye contact, in the only way it was safe to pass it. That was care, in the only form the system permitted. It should not have been the only form available, but it was what she had, and she gave it. On day 14 I sat on the edge of the bathtub and something shifted in me. Not dramatically. Not with tears or resolve or a moment of clarity the way it happens in stories. Just a quiet, cold recognition. I thought, if I do not tell someone, no one will know, and if no one knows, this will continue. And if this continues, I will not survive it the way I am currently surviving it. Which is to say, barely. I did not tell a doctor. I did not have access to one without involving Elam, and I did not yet have the language to explain to Elam what needed to be said. I told Elam I was unwell. I used the word unwell. I said I needed a week. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "All right, that was all right. I have thought about that moment many times since, about how much hung on 2 words from a man who had the authority to say the opposite. About how that small act of decency, which should have been the floor, not the ceiling, felt, in that moment, like relief. That is what a system does to your calibration. It makes ordinary decency feel like grace." The bleeding stopped. The pain became something I managed rather than something I was submerged in, but the pattern that those 14 days established did not stop. What those days taught me, what the system had designed me to learn, was that my body's signals were subordinate to my role. That pain was not a reason to stop. That discomfort was adjustment. That a good wife found a way to manage what her body was telling her and presented a smooth face to the world. I carried that lesson for years. It shaped how I understood my pregnancies. It shaped how I understood illness. It shaped how I understood my own interior experience as secondary. As relevant only when it threatened my ability to function. A therapist once asked me, "When did you learn that your body's signals were not trustworthy information?" I did not have to think about the answer. I said 14 days after my wedding. When I described those 14 days to my therapist, years later, In a small office, far from Holmes County, she listened without interrupting. And then she said, "What you experienced was a physical trauma response in a person with no access to medical care, no consent framework, no language for refusal, and no community support structure that prioritized her physical well-being over her marital function." She said the bleeding was your body's way of signaling that something was wrong. And you were in a system that had specifically removed every channel through which that signal could be heard and acted on. Every channel removed, that is what I want you to understand. It was not neglect in the ordinary sense. It was not that no one cared. It was that the system had deliberately, not cruelly, but deliberately closed every door through which a young woman's physical distress could become a problem that needed solving. Because solving it would have required naming it, and naming it would have disrupted the silence, and the silence was load-bearing. My mother-in-law handed me that jar of salve without words. I believe now that she knew exactly why I might need it. I believe she had needed it herself. I believe the wordlessness of the gesture was not indifference but the only form of care the system had permitted her to develop. My mother gave me 7 words and a loaf of bread rising on the counter. She had been given fewer. Elam told me it would pass because his father had told him the same. The information traveled, father to son, mother to daughter, stripped of everything that might have made it useful, carrying only the instruction to endure. The system produced this, not the people. That is not an excuse for the people. Adults make choices inside systems, and some of those choices cause harm. But understanding where the architecture came from is the only way to stop building it. This is an Amish story, but I know it is not only an Amish story. If you were raised in a community, religious, cultural, or familial, where your body's pain was treated as secondary to your role, then you know something of what I'm describing. If you ever hurt and stayed silent because you did not know you were allowed to speak, because there was no one to tell, because naming the cause would have required naming something the community had declared unnameable, then this story is for you. If you ever made breakfast while you were bleeding, because that is what the role required. I see you. You were not strong for enduring it. You were failed by every person and system that should have prepared you, protected you, and made sure you knew that your pain was not acceptable collateral. You were not weak. The framework was wrong, not you. I want to name Miriam, not her real name. But Miriam, if you hear this, the witch Hazel helped. I know you knew it would. I know you had been where I was standing. I know the sheet you were unpinning gave you something to look at so you did not have to watch me receive what you were handing me. What you gave me was small and practical and wrapped in cover. It was also an act of love inside a system that had almost no room for it. I remember you. Your pain is not adjustment. Your body is not a covenant obligation. The bleeding was real. The silence around it was constructed. You were allowed to say it hurt. You were always allowed. The system just made sure you didn't know that. Now you do. If this video reached something in you, leave a comment. 1 word is enough. You do not have to explain yourself to be witnessed here. There are things I cannot say fully on this platform. The written version, what I call the ordnung they never wrote down, goes further. The link is below. Subscribe. The next video is about what the Amish church tells a woman when she becomes pregnant, and what her husband is still permitted to expect from her body. It is a harder story. I'm going to tell it. I will see you there.